Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Rabbi zidni ilma. Okay, this is going to be our third week, first lecture. That is going to be the part for your second term exam syllabus. So today we are actually going to discuss about cell membrane, which is actually the structural part of your cells and tissues. So whenever we are going into the details of cells, as we have described earlier, that we are going to talk about like its structural parts, its functional parts, because cell is actually a unit, basic unit for structure and the function of any living organisms. So that's why when we are talking about cells, about their structural and functional importance, definitely there are organelles which are very much specific to its specific functions, which are actually the structural and the functional. Now, going into the details of cell membrane, what we are going to study or what we are going to learn is to know about the structural and functional details of any cell membrane, and to learn about why cell membrane is called as selectively permeable membrane. As before in your previous classes, you might have come across the term about selective permeability, that the cell membrane is actually allowing some of the molecules to pass through, and it does not allow the others to pass through the same structure. So what is the selectively permeable thing, or what is the basis on which the cell is actually letting some things in and letting go of certain things out of the cell? So this is what is the objective of today's class. Then after the end of the class, hopefully we will be able to understand the real structure of cell membrane, to explain its selective permeability, and then we will be inshallah able to differentiate between molecular structures which are actually responsible for transport of materials in and out of cells. So the actual reason behind the selective permeability will be clear. Formally starting our class with the structural function of the cell membrane, here you can see on your screens that we have a cell membrane structure in which there are brown balls-like structures like this, and these ball-like structures have somehow tail-like structures in between the two layers. So the layers actually you can see is called as lipid bilayer structure, in which two lipid layers are actually which are actually bounded or in such a way present in such a way that these are making two complete layers without any single gap. The topmost part, as the screen mentions, it's a hydrophilic region. That means a water-loving region. So this is the part which is actually going to interact with water, and the hydrophobic region, which is water-faring region, or the area which does not interact with water, is actually embedded in between. Or simply, when we talk about cells, about its outer environment, about its inner environment, definitely most of the part that we have is fluid or watery in nature. So the part which is actually exposed to outer environment and the part which is exposed to inner environment, both are actually facing with the help of this hydrophilic regions. What are these hydrophilic regions? What are these hydrophobic regions? Are going to be discussed in upcoming slides. Then you have transport proteins in blue color in front of you, and these transport proteins, as the name indicates, are definitely responsible for transport of materials from outside of the cell towards the inside, or from inside towards the outside environment. Then there is a green structure you can see is present in the form of long chain. That can be cholesterol and depositions, or these can be some sort of conjugated molecules, which will be inshallah explained in next slides. Then there is a detailed structure of like what is the major function of cell membrane. You can see these are acting as a gatekeeper. Whenever we have some sort of entrance point, we do have a person or some sort of entrance check, that who is going to enter and who is totally not allowed to enter the facility. So same like that, in our cells we do have a gatekeeper in the form of a cell membrane, which is actually responsible for letting some of the things in and out. It regulates what comes in and out of the cell. That is the same thing which is actually the function of a gatekeeper. Then main components are proteins and phospholipids. Proteins are something which are actually the macromolecules, which are high molecular weight compounds, and these are made up of simplest units that we call as amino acids. And then we have a phospholipid. Phospholipid, as you can see, is a conjugated molecule, it's a conjugate of phosphate ion, which is attached with the lipid content. And don't forget, lipids are basically fats which are made up of fatty acids and glycerols. Again, these are macromolecules. So along with this macromolecule, lipid molecule, there is a phosphate group attached, which is actually a molecular ion in its structure. The cell membrane is selectively permeable, that allows some things through without energy, but not everything. So with energy and without energy concept will be inshallah explained as well, that the things which are moving from a higher concentration to lower concentration or along the concentration gradient and obviously do not require energy to pass through. But the things which are greater in size or which are not following the amount of gradient or concentration gradient are actually involving amount of energy to be consumed. Then it says that all cells have a cell membrane. Functions is to control what enters and exits the cell to maintain an internal balance called as homeostasis. Homeostasis is something which is actually responsible, a mechanism which is responsible to maintain the internal environment of a cell. In any environment, if the conditions are not met, or if the requirements or the components which are actually required in a specific percentage are not properly met, then what happens? That the loss or the shortage of something is actually responsible for stoppage of certain functioning. And similarly, if for example, if I'm talking about water content, if there is more than required content of water, definitely things are going to be neutralized, though so reactions will be not possible as to maintain their exact speed as compared to the ones which are happening in the presence of a proper amount of water. Similarly, if the pH of the cell is disturbed, definitely there are certain chemicals which are not working at acidic pH or at the basic pH. Rather, they are comfortably doing the same process on their neutral phase. So if their pH of the cell is disturbed, if there are salt contents which are more or less than required state, if there is water content which is actually not in a normal state, then the condition is called to be imbalanced. So to maintain the balance of any environment inside the cell is called as homeostasis. So cell membrane is actually responsible for homeostasis of the cell by letting in the material which is required and letting go of the material which is in excess or is harmful to the cell. Similarly, it provides protection and support for the cell, although cell membrane is not providing as much protection or support as compared to cell wall, which is hard in its nature, but still there is a flexibility in cell membranes which is actually responsible for the protection and the support. Coming to the details of the phospholipids, we have discussed, I have said that it's a conjugated molecule of phosphate ion and the lipid structure. So this is made up of two sides, the head and tail. The purple region, you can see it's a ball or egg-like structure. That is actually the phosphate part, which is having a positive or negative charge. While the tail-like structure that you can see is actually the fatty acid chain, and it is a hydrophobic part. That means this is the part which is actually not interacting with water or not allowing any sort of polar molecules to get in. And this is the part, that hydrophilic part, the head part, which is actually containing the phosphate molecules, are the points which are actually polar in nature, and the water is going through these parts for sure. If you are going into the detailed structure of the lipid bilayer, that is 2 layers of phospholipids are present. The phosphate head is a polar, that is water loving, and fatty acid tails, that is non-polar in nature and is water faring. And if you can see, this is a long chain of fatty acids which is acting like a tail, and then there is a cluster of structures which are embedded, and this ball-like cluster-like structure is actually making the head. Proteins are embedded in the membrane. Here you can see the pink colored structures are the proteins which are actually sandwiched between the 2 layers of the lipid. Then we have carrier proteins that is mentioned in the purple color. These are the proteins which are responsible for carriage or transport of materials in and out of cells. Don't forget, when we talk about the amino acids, when we talk about proteins, they do have a polar nature. They do have positive and negative ends. Now the question is, if there is phosphate region already present, which is actually a polar region, and then what is the need for this protein channel? So the things which are polar in nature can pass through the phosphate heads, then why there is requirement of proper another type of channel through which the molecules can enter? So the answer is the larger molecules, which are actually not possible, which for them it is not possible to pass through these phosphate heads, which is actually allowing a very slow space for larger weight molecules. For them, there is a protein channel provided. And these proteins are actually acting as a receptor site for most of the viruses and the parasites as well, that they provide actually the attachment sites. And then for the larger molecules to get through, they have a larger gates or doors like structures which are opened by consuming the energies. So when a larger molecule is going to enter or leave the cell, definitely these gates are opened, and these gates are opened on account of your reserved energy sources in the form of ATPs. Or if the molecules are small enough that the gates are not required to be opened, these proteins just act like simply as a tunnel that materials can pass through. Now you can see that there's a fluid mosaic model of the cell membrane, and this fluid mosaic model is actually the model on the basis of which we have got our cell membrane structure. And in case of like a fluid mosaic model, when we talk about the word fluid, that comes from the material of its structure. Like cell membrane is actually not a hard material, rather it is just like a fluid material which is actually flexible enough to accommodate any changes in it. And secondly, the mosaic pattern is the word that comes from the surface is not smooth. As you can see, the surface of the cell structure, which is present right here, is having a protein structures which are present over the top layer. So this protein layer on the top layer is responsible for making it look like uneven surfaces, and these uneven surfaces are the surface type structures which we call as mosaic patterns. Next thing you can see is cell membrane have pores, means holes in it, and these pores or holes are actually present for selective permeability. And these pores, what we have talked about, the protein nature, protein structures, that's what we have talked about. That's what we call as pores, or the tunnels through which the things are going to be enter or leave the cell. So these pores provide as tunnels, or the passage or the freeways through which things can enter the or leave the cell. So this structure helps it be selective. Then there is a final setting that is shown that outside of the cell, and this is going to be inside of the cell. And the thing that we have already mentioned is the hydrophilic region is actually facing the water content or the outside environment. Even if I'm talking about the inside layer, it is also facing the cytoplasm, and don't forget cytoplasm is 70 to 90% water. And if I'm talking about the hydrophilic range, which is actually facing the outside of cell, then again, don't forget, there is fluid, there is some sort of next cells territory, which is again facing towards the next phosphate ends. So that is the complete structure of your cell membrane, in which two most important things are the proteins and the lipid structures. And the proteins are actually embedded between the lipid bilayer structures, and these proteins can be glycoproteins, and it can be on the top of surface, or it can be sandwiched in between the two lipid layers. If I'm talking about the proteins which are present on the surface, these are called as external or extrinsic proteins, and the proteins which are embedded inside are called as internal or intrinsic proteins. So these were the structures which we have studied about fluid mosaic model, and this was the complete structure of cell membrane. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.